The stage manager's hand dropped. Camera 1 went live, and in that moment, Ed Sullivan realized he had made a mistake he couldn't undo. Not the kind of mistake you apologize for, the kind that changes what's possible. Studio 50 held 728 people that night in February 1964, every seat filled, but the number that mattered was 0. That's how many people in the building, including Ed Sullivan himself, understood what was about to happen. The Beatles stood on stage, instruments ready, waiting for Ed's introduction. Ed looked at them from the wings. 4 young men with hair that violated every rule he'd built his career defending, and he was about to give them America, not just airtime. America itself. The decision was already made. The cameras were rolling, but Ed's hand, gripping the edge of the curtain, was white-knuckled, because he knew this wasn't a performance he was introducing. This was a transfer of power he couldn't stop. If you understand how systems collapse from the inside, you should subscribe. This isn't a story about music. It's not about the Beatles or British invasion or the night. Those are the stories people tell when they want to avoid talking about what actually happened. This is about the moment when a man who controlled American culture for 16 years discovered that control is just borrowed time, that the system you built can be taken from you by the very people you let inside it. You think this is about rock and roll. It's not. It's about what happens when a gatekeeper opens the gate and realizes too late that gates only work in one direction. To understand what Ed Sullivan was feeling in that moment, you need to understand what the Ed Sullivan Show actually was. Not what it looked like to viewers, what it was structurally. The Ed Sullivan Show wasn't entertainment. It was a mechanism of cultural permission. Every Sunday night at 8 p.m., 70 million Americans watched Ed Sullivan decide what was acceptable, what music was safe, what comedy was appropriate, what performers deserved access to American living rooms. Ed didn't just host a show, he operated a filtration system. Acts appeared on his stage only after passing through layers of approval. Standards and practices reviewed their material. Network executives evaluated their marketability. Ed himself made the final decision, and once something appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show, it became legitimate, sanctioned American. The system worked because it was closed. Ed controlled entry. He decided who got 6 minutes on his stage and who got nothing. If you wanted to reach American audiences, you needed Ed Sullivan's approval. There was no alternative path, no way around it. The Ed Sullivan Show was the gateway, and Ed was the gatekeeper. And gatekeepers, by definition, have absolute power until they don't. What nobody realized in February 1964 was that the moment Ed introduced the Beatles, the gate stopped being optional. It became a formality. And formalities don't have power, they have momentum. And momentum doesn't care who started it. The decision to book the Beatles hadn't been Ed's idea. His talent coordinators had been pushing for months. The Beatles were massive in England. They were about to explode in America. I Want to Hold Your Hand was climbing the charts. Capitol Records was spending unprecedented money on promotion. Every indicator said the Beatles were going to be huge, with or without the Ed Sullivan Show. But Ed resisted. He'd seen British acts before. They never translated to American audiences. The music was too different, the accents too foreign, the style too strange. American teenagers wanted American music. That's how it had always worked. And Ed trusted the system until his talent coordinator showed him something that changed the calculation. December 1963. Ed Sullivan was at London's Heathrow Airport, returning from a trip abroad. He saw something he'd never seen before. Thousands of teenagers screaming, pushing against barriers, held back by police. Pandemonium. Ed asked what was happening. The Beatles are arriving from Sweden, someone told him. Ed watched 4 young men emerge from the plane. The crowd erupted. Girls screaming, some crying, some fainting. It wasn't just enthusiasm, it was something else. Something Ed had never witnessed. Mass hysteria focused on 4 musicians. Ed made a decision right there. Book them, whatever it costs, because this wasn't about music. This was about capturing a phenomenon before someone else did. The negotiation was simple. 3 appearances, 2 live, 1 taped. Total payment $10,000, far less than the Beatles were worth. But Brian Epstein, their manager, didn't care about the money. He cared about the platform. The Ed Sullivan Show reached 70 million Americans. That was the prize. The Beatles agreed immediately. Ed's staff began preparing for the February 9th broadcast, and that's when the problems started. What Ed didn't understand about the Beatles was that they weren't just musicians with unusual hair. They represented something his system had no category for. They were polite, but not deferential. Professional, but not obedient. They answered questions with humor that subtly mocked the questions themselves. They wore suits but looked wrong in them. They existed in a space Ed's system couldn't process. Not rebellion. Something more dangerous. Indifference to the rules everyone else followed. The rehearsal was February. Ed watched from the control room as the Beatles set up on stage. Their equipment looked wrong. Their posture looked wrong. The way they interacted with his crew looked wrong. Not disrespectful. Just separate. Like they were operating according to different rules Ed couldn't see. During the sound check, Paul McCartney made a joke to the audience. Nothing inappropriate. But it got a laugh. A big laugh. Ed noticed. The audience wasn't laughing with permission. They were just laughing. That hadn't happened before on his show. Laughter on the Ed Sullivan Show was controlled, cued, expected. This was different. This was organic. And organic things don't follow systems. After rehearsal, Ed met with the Beatles in his office. It was supposed to be a friendly conversation, a welcome, but it became something else. Ed explained how his show worked, the importance of professionalism, the need to respect American audiences. The Beatles nodded, but their nodding felt wrong. They were agreeing without agreeing, acknowledging without accepting. Ed asked them to tone down their performance slightly, to be slightly less energetic. John Lennon smiled. "We'll do our best, Mr. Sullivan," but the smile said something else. It said, "We're going to do exactly what we do, and you're going to let us, because you need us more than we need you." That's when Ed understood. The power dynamic had already shifted. He just hadn't announced it yet. Show night. February 9th. Studio 50 was packed. The audience was different than usual. Ed Sullivan crowds. Younger. More girls. More energy. They weren't here for Ed. They were here for the Beatles. And everyone in the building knew it. Backstage, Ed's staff was nervous. This crowd felt unstable. What if they rushed the stage? What if things got out of control? Ed dismissed their concerns. He'd been doing this for 16 years. He knew how to manage an audience. He'd introduce the Beatles. They'd perform. He'd maintain control. That was the script. But scripts only work when everyone's reading from the same one. Ed walked onto stage at 8 p.m. To his usual applause, he did his opening remarks, introduced some other guests. The audience was polite but restless. They were waiting. At 8:15 p.m., Ed stood at center stage and delivered the introduction that 73 million Americans heard. "Ladies and gentlemen, the Beatles." The studio erupted, not applause. Screaming. The kind of screaming that doesn't stop, that builds on itself, that feeds its own intensity. The Beatles walked onto Ed Sullivan's stage. And in that moment, Ed's show stopped being Ed's show. It became their show. He'd invited them in, but they'd taken over. The performance itself lasted 6 minutes. "All my loving, till there was you. She loves you." But what happened during those 6 minutes wasn't a performance. It was a demonstration. The Beatles didn't perform for Ed Sullivan's audience. They performed for their own audience that happened to be in Ed Sullivan's studio. The distinction mattered. Ed had built his career on being the mediator, the translator, the one who made new things safe for American consumption. But the Beatles didn't need translation. They didn't need Ed's approval or contextualization. They bypassed him entirely, went straight to the audience. And the audience responded, not to Ed's authority, but to the Beatles' direct appeal. Ed stood in the wings, watching. And for the first time in 16 years, he felt invisible on his own show. The cameras weren't on him. The audience wasn't thinking about him. He'd become a formality. The person who introduced the thing people actually cared about. The thing about gatekeepers is they derive power from scarcity. When there's only one gate, the gatekeeper is essential. But when the gate becomes wide enough, when what comes through is so powerful, it doesn't need permission. The gatekeeper becomes decorative, an announcement rather than an authority. The performance ended. The screaming continued. Ed walked back on stage to thank the Beatles and transitioned to the next segment. He said the words, but his words were irrelevant. The Beatles had already communicated directly with 73 million Americans, and that communication hadn't gone through Ed. It had gone around him. The system he'd built was still there, but it was already obsolete. It just hadn't admitted it yet. The next morning, every newspaper in America led with the same story. Not Ed Sullivan presents the Beatles. Just the Beatles. Ed's name appeared in the articles, but as context, as the venue rather than the event. He'd been central to American entertainment for 16 years. Now he was a footnote to something bigger. The ratings came in, 82.6% share, 73 million viewers, the highest-rated entertainment program in television history. Ed had achieved something unprecedented, and in achieving it, he'd made himself unnecessary. What happened over the next week revealed something about how power actually changes hands. Ed Sullivan's show continued. He remained the host. Bookings kept coming. But something fundamental had shifted. Before the Beatles, acts came to Ed Sullivan, asking for approval. After the Beatles, acts came offering him access. The gate still existed. But now Ed needed the acts, more than the acts needed Ed. That's not a subtle difference. That's a complete inversion of power. The Beatles appeared on Ed's show twice more. Each time, the ratings were astronomical. Each time, Ed's centrality diminished slightly more. By the third appearance, he wasn't introducing the Beatles to America. He was hosting them as established stars who were generous enough to appear on his show. The language changed. The dynamics changed. The system remained intact. But it was running in reverse. And systems running in reverse don't feel like systems anymore. They feel like habits. Here's what Ed Sullivan realized too late. Scarcity creates power, but abundance destroys it. When the Ed Sullivan Show was the only way to reach American audiences, Ed had absolute power. But by giving the Beatles that platform, by opening the gate that wide, he'd proven that mass audience access was possible, and once something is proven possible, it becomes inevitable. Other shows started booking rock acts. Other platforms emerged. The gate multiplied, and when gates multiply, gatekeepers become obsolete. The real consequence wasn't that Ed lost his show. He didn't. The Ed Sullivan Show continued until 1971. Ed remained influential, but his influence became advisory rather than mandatory, a recommendation rather than a requirement. Acts could succeed without him. That had never been true before, and once it became true, the entire architecture of power in entertainment restructured around that new reality. Not overnight, gradually. The way systems always collapse. slowly, then all at once, then retroactively, as if they'd never existed. Ed Sullivan died in 1974. Obituaries called him a legend, the man who introduced America to the Beatles, Elvis, the Rolling Stones. But that framing was already nostalgic, already treating him as history rather than authority. The system he'd built had outlived him by only 3 years, and it had stopped being his system long before that. Probably the moment 4 young men from Liverpool walked onto his stage and demonstrated that gates are just ceremonies, and ceremonies only have the power we agree to give them. This is what systems can't defend against, not destruction, not competition. Proof that the system was never necessary, that what it controlled was always accessible, just gated for convenience, not impossibility. When the Beatles bypassed Ed Sullivan while standing on his stage, they didn't destroy his system, they just demonstrated it was optional. And optional systems don't last. They fade, like momentum without fuel, like power without scarcity, like a gate everyone realizes they can walk around. The final evidence appeared years after Ed's death. In interviews, the Beatles were asked about the Ed Sullivan Show. Their answers were polite but revealing. They thanked Ed for the opportunity, but they didn't credit him with their success. They treated him like a venue, a place they performed, not the reason they succeeded. And that's how history remembered it. Ed Sullivan presented the Beatles. He didn't create them. He didn't enable them. He just happened to be there when they arrived. And arrival doesn't require permission. It just requires arrival. Have you ever watched someone give away the only thing protecting their power? Not dramatically, just by opening the door too wide. That's not tragedy. That's inevitability. If this story showed you something you didn't expect to see, subscribe, because some collapses look like triumphs until you realize what was actually traded, and by then, the trade is permanent.